let Sinead take it away and we can get going. So Sinead, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate, I think, in this really important conference. And it's a real pleasure and a real honour to be on this panel with these wonderful women here today. So back in 2016, I attended a lecture in Queen's in Belfast for International Women's Day, and it was delivered by the great African-American activist Angela Davis. And in her lecture, Davis argued that the minoritization of women, of people of colour, of trans people, of LGBTQI people, she said this is designed to compel us to think of these problems as other or as marginal. In other words, not the central problem or not the real problem. Davis argued that in her experiences as an activist over many, many decades, she has found that the greatest insights come from issues that appear to be the most marginal or sometimes the least important. And the reason she said this, the reason she found this, she said, was because they render visible the ideological work of institutions and of state apparatuses. And I think women's experiences in particular reveal this, the intersection of institutional violence, of intimate violence. And by focusing on these issues, we can gain, I think, important insights into the wider structural and institutional problems in our society. So I want to take my lead from Angela Davis and begin by asking the question, what image of the partitioned state, North and South, emerges if we consider it from the perspective of women? Now, I'm going to I know Fiona's going to talk about the northern state, so I'm just going to kind of concentrate for now on the southern state. So thinking about the Southern Irish state through the lens of women and sexuality allows us to not only understand how the oppression of women was one of the central tenets on which the partitioned state was constructed, but it also makes visible the hidden structures of domination and exploitation that are far from just being an undesirable side effect, as they're often kind of projected, but that they are central to the existence and the maintenance of the neoliberal state, North and South. So what does this mean? At a basic level, it is about, I think, drawing attention to the erasure of women, particularly working class women, from Irish history and from public life. Something that kind of in some ways seems quite straightforward, but you would think that 5 decades after the kind of feminist movement that we wouldn't have to keep shouting about this, but we do. And we just have to look at the whole invisibility of women around the COVID-19 pandemic as just the most recent example of that. But this in and of itself, it's not just about putting women back into the story. That's not enough. It's not just sometimes, as you kind of see this, sometimes it's about, sometimes if you substitute the female subject for that of the male. That's not what I'm arguing here. And because sometimes if you see, around the centenary around 1916, it was often about let's find the stories of women and let's kind of tell the story of 1916 through the lens of women. That's not what I'm arguing. It's about restoring the idea of conflict and ambiguity into our frame when we're looking at the story, and to explore the unequal terms upon which people get to participate in the stories of how we understand our society and the country in which we live in. And it's not simply about substituting women for men, because if you just do that, you end up with the same story. By focusing on the question of women, going back to what Angela Davis said, it reveals a different picture, a far more complex picture. And in doing so, I think we get to the sort of the nub of the nature of the Irish state. And by extension, I think it reveals important truths about the nature of capitalism in our world today. So let's turn our attention to, for a few minutes, to the construction of the Irish state. So the Irish state regulation and containment of women, the female, women's bodies in particular, became central to the project of national identity formation with the foundation of the state in 1922. And in many ways, women's bodies came to represent the kind of repressed histories and the political desires of the Irish state by forcing women to live their lives invisibly. In the wonderful phrase by the visual artists Sarah Brown and Jessie Jones, women lived their lives in the shadow of the state. So that women were marginalized in terms of the story and narrative of the state, and yet the state continued to exercise huge levels of influence on how they live their lives and on their very bodies. So in the struggle for definition and identity, this kind of fledgling partition state that emerges in 1922, there was an unsurprising but a deliberate, ideologically driven attempt to define Ireland as not England. So this new state seeks to create for itself an identity. And this led, I suppose, in some way to the search for distinguishing marks of Irish identity, in which Catholicism and women's reproducing bodies would become central. Now, obviously, Catholicism plays a role in this, but focusing just on Catholicism is insufficient, because for all the deference shown to Catholic teaching by the Irish state, the formal and constitutional structures of the state were steadfastly liberal democratic, and the post-independent elite that emerges in the 1920s were committed to creating a state that was both Catholic but also capitalist. And that's the bit I think that's often missing in a lot of these kind of narratives and a lot of these kind of histories that are emerging that look back over the history of the state. So for a newly formed state, born out of counter-revolutionary struggle, that if you were at the plenary panel, there was a really good discussion on, the regulation and control of sexual behavior in general, but particularly women's sexuality, created a sense of social stability for a state that was in flux. Regulating women's bodies and sexuality was about more than marginalizing women, but it was central to how the power of the newly emerging Catholic middle classes, who, if you like, kind of emerged out of that kind of counter-revolutionary period as the bearers of stability and morality. And it was how they extended and reinforced their power. This was not inevitable, as some people argue, but it was rather the political logic of the counter-revolutionary forces that came to dominate within the Irish state following the Civil War. So the state adopts Catholicism as one of its principal regulating ideologies, and that also served to kind of confer upon this new state some kind of form of legitimacy. And we see very quickly in the 1920s, a whole range of legal measures are introduced in order to erase women from public life. Things like the Jury Bills of 1924 and 1927, the Civil Service Amendment Acts of 1925 and the Conditions of Employment Act of 1935, the carrying over of the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which outlaws abortion in all circumstances, and then divorce is prohibited in 1925, the sale and importation of contraceptions in 1935. And women's sexuality is channeled into childbearing and family life in the home, and that is the kind of key moment for that is the 1937 Constitution, in which in Article 41 the institutions of the family and marriage are given privileged positions, and women's position in the home as not having a public life but having a private life is enshrined. Two final points. This regulatory framework for sexuality is not unique to Ireland, okay? And in some ways, it's not all that dissimilar to what's happening in other European countries in the 1920s. It's part of those kind of, the post-war ideological efforts to recenter women's lives back into the domestic sphere after the First World War. The sociologist Tom Inglis argues that this kind of Irish prudery around sexuality, again, is not unique to Ireland, but finds its origin in the wider context of Victorian attitudes to women, marriage and the family. Although it is significant, he notes, that this Victorian regime lasts in Ireland and far longer than anywhere else, and it becomes seeped, he says, into the minds and bodies of the Irish. My final point is that I think for the new post-colonial Irish capitalist state, the critic Michael Cronin has argued, one that is born out of counter-revolutionary struggle, including significant socialist and feminist movements. The regulation and control of behaviour creates this sense of social stability. And it gives a kind of an ideology to that newly empowered Catholic middle classes. And then we see, as I think we'll probably go on to discuss in this panel, it's always society's most marginalized bodies, the poor, the infant, and women, who become incarcerated into a nexus of church-state institutions that includes things like the Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, industrial schools and reformatories, and psychiatric hospitals. And we now know that this vision of a stable traditional family that's so cherished by this kind of Catholic conservative Ireland, we now know, as we'll hear from Siobhan, it rested upon a particularly brutal system of containment in which women and their children were considered little more than a commodity for trade amongst religious orders, with, and let's not forget, the full knowledge and the complicity of the Irish states. And while the effects of this regime were most profoundly experienced by those who either failed or refused to conform, this whole culture of containment, I think, deeply infected the entirety of Irish society. And despite the dismantling of many of these apparatuses and control, the oppression of women, I think, has continued to remain a feature of Irish capitalism, and argued in different ways, has altered, but has become intensified in different ways under neoliberalism, that obviously other speakers will have time to talk about, will talk about in their talks. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Sinead. And your contribution, I think, really flows on well to our next speaker, Siobhan, who will be giving us some of the context on the mother and baby homes crisis and where next. So Siobhan, take it away.
Many thanks for inviting me to speak at this very important conference. And I feel very privileged to be on this panel, and I was very interested to hear what you had to say, Sinead. So just to begin, I would like to say that in the apology that Micheál Martin gave to us survivors, he was correct in admitting the Irish Republic embraced a perverse religious morality and a warped attitude to sexuality. But we have to remember this moral authority did not exist in a vacuum. There was a strong alignment of views between church and state. And on both sides of the border, let's not forget, church moral codes were revered, and after partition became a lot more entrenched in the religious dogmas. For most of the 20th century, the worst thing you could do, north or south of the border, was to become pregnant outside of marriage. This was seen as much worse than committing a rape, incest, or a murder. And across Ireland, north and south, women and girls were seen as bringing shame to themselves, their families, and their parishes. And under fundamental and deeply conservative views, Catholic and Protestant churches othered pregnant, unmarried females. We were abandoned. We were incarcerated into mother and baby homes by our families, our clergy, our state, our government, and our doctors. Outside, there were high walls to protect society from us offenders and to conceal our illegitimate children. We were made work. We were separated from our babies, who in turn were neglected, boarded out, or forced into adoption. These homes were mostly established by the local authorities, and they were given over to be run by religious communities, evangelicals, the Salvation Army, boards, charities, or those with strict religious moral codes. But the Irish state funded and inspected these homes. Despite this, very high morality rates went on, and these were well known to the national and local authorities. But they were too busy deferring to the religious orders that ran these homes, or being deferential to the local diocesan bishop, to do anything about these 9,000 or so babies that died under the care of these religious people. So the authorities turned their blind eye, and the deaths continued. And so, to bring it more up to date, in 1986, 2 years before my fall, 15-year-old Anne Lovett died trying to give birth with a scissors beside a grotto. And unmarried mother Joanne Hayes was accused of murdering a baby. And only in 2018 did the state or the Gardaí apologise to Joanne Hayes for this injustice. She did not murder that other baby. So with this in mind, when I myself became pregnant 2 years after Anne Lovett and Joanne Hayes, I was beyond petrified. What would become of me? Another teenager pregnant. Where would I be put, and what would be done? The utter shame I felt. And it was 4.5 months before I told my parents, and the fallout was bleak. The first thing that was talked about was the shame I'd brought on the family and how I had to be put away. And the first port of call, as it was for many parents up and down Ireland, was to resort to the church and ask what they thought and what should be done with me. And out came a member of the church, ranting and raving like a possessed demon. I was a sinner. I had shamed my family. I was no longer welcome in the church. I was never to come into the church showing off my sin or bringing my illegitimate child with me if I hadn't kept that child. I had to be put away, and the baby had to be adopted. I was so ashamed of what a bad daughter I was and how I had disgraced my family. But I felt lucky I was not going to be put out on the street, and I was given this mother and baby home to live in, and I'd go there in secret. But the reality was quite different when I got there. It was the 80s, but it was still punitive, and the negative attitudes against unmarried mothers and pregnant unmarried women was still extreme. It was punitive. I had to work for my keep. I scrubbed floors. I scrubbed stairs on bended knee, 9 months pregnant. And I was told night and day what a sinner I was and a bad person. And I would never be a good mother. When my baby was born, he was legally classified as illegitimate. In the home, like the other women and girls before me, I was not allowed to bond with him. And I was put under constant pressure and coercion to have him adopted. I was told I had nothing to offer him whatsoever, and I had to give him up. If we skip forward to 2017, I was under the illusion that it was a good thing to present myself to the confidential committee of the mother and baby home investigation. I was naive. I wish I had never set foot in that room with the confidential committee. Along with every other survivor of mother and baby homes, our nightmare began in January 2021. Following December 2020, the government sealed the records of the Commission of Investigation for 30 years. And as the days and weeks went by, it became obvious how this was in their and both churches' interest. Micheál Martin proudly stood up as he gave lip service and his apology, his shallow apology. He confirmed this report was the definitive work and the truth of what happened. And so the collusion between the Irish Church and the state continued. This report was not the truth. Inaccuracies prevail. The majority of the research came from the home's own records and its propaganda. I do not recognize my home or the description of the girls or conditions there. This commission managed to collude with these religious orders and churches. I do not agree that girls and women after 1973 had somewhere to go. I didn't. I do not agree the homes were refuges, more like prisons where we were made work and were shamed and babies neglected. The blame was put on our families, fathers, and society, and the church and state was an after mention. And this shameful report, in its collusion with the churches, ignored our survivor testimony, and it took the nuns and evangelicals' words as gospel. I, like many other survivors, found my testimony butchered in the report, twisted and littered with inaccuracies and falsehoods. It firmly took all the guilt off the religious in the home and put it on my family. And in the report, it said there was no physical abuse. What about those teenage girls that were left in labor for 3 days by themselves with no pain relief or support, and then had a baby ripped out of them? What do they call starving babies left in nappies, crawling with maggots, covered in sores, choking to death on porridge that they couldn't digest? Is that not physical abuse? And what about a recommendation for an investigation into the 9,000 babies and all those mothers with no death certs or no way of knowing how they died investigated? The report also advises there was no evidence of forced adoption. Philomena Lee and thousands of others would disagree. Then the commission destroyed our tapes. Our tapes are our evidence and are the full truth of what happened. And they also show what the commission showed, what the religious really did in these homes. This is the truth. This report does not hold the Catholic or Protestant churches that ran these institutions to full account. And oh yes, the Irish state apologized, the Catholic primate, and there was various statements from bishops and nuns, and even the Protestant church gave a bit of an apology, very begrudgingly, as it apologized belatedly for one home while it pretended it didn't manage any of the others. So do we believe this government is sorry and will ensure justice prevails? Well, let's look at what happened this week. There were developers discussing planning to build 179 apartments on the mass graves of 923 discarded babies. The government remains silent. In my imagined United Ireland, the state would seize the lands of Bessborough and the other entire mother and baby homes and memorialize them like Auschwitz. It would start an investigation into the deaths of all the children and mothers from these homes. There would be inquests, coroner's reports, death certs. Religious and their orders or churches would be made accountable. GlaxoSmyth would pay for those survivors who they put vaccine trials on. The religious and Protestant churches would be forced to pay for most of the redress. Lands would be taken from them till they pay up. The local authorities would step forward and apologize and pay for memorials. Survivors' testimonies in the report would be corrected, and an independent external commission would conduct a truthful human rights report. Documents would be found to expose the real truth. In parallel with its treatment of victims from industrial schools, church-run schools, Magdalene asylums, survivors of mother and baby homes are being put through the mill to get the truth out. The state has failed us survivors again. A progressive united Ireland must learn from the past that church and state must be separated. We have had enough of both states' moral authority and collusion with both church. A progressive Ireland will not hold reverence to any church, north or south of Ireland. We want no to more Catholic or Protestant Taliban on the island of Ireland. The churches are the ones that need to be cast out of our constitution and women's lives. We citizens must always come first.
Thank you so much for that, Siobhan. You know, an extremely moving account of what you went through and a very powerful call for action of exactly what we want to see in an alternative united Ireland, where this type of thing will be properly accounted for and will never happen again. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very moving. So to follow from that, next of all, Smyth will speak. So Ailbhe, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and good morning, everybody. I am really absolutely delighted to be on this panel and with such wonderful speakers who have already set out the bases and the consequences so eloquently and movingly in the case of Siobhan for the invisibilization and marginalization of women. I should just say that in case you're wondering, the weird green background is a technical hitch and not a political statement. I was scheduled, unbeknownst to me, to speak today at a session on church and state, but I had a look at the programme and I said to myself, what about women, gender, LGBTIQs? What about social movement politics and campaigning in the context of striving for an alternative way of shaping and achieving a united Ireland? I made my views known and the organisers resolved the problem of the missing parts by creating a panel with the title Women in a United Ireland. Is there a parallel session today or any day on men in a united Ireland? Of course not. People would think that was ridiculous. It may be that women are assumed as a given, not in need of being singled out for special attention. There is a logic to that, but it also indicates an enduring failure to understand the central difference that gender makes to women. Gender is a crucial social variable for women to a greater or lesser extent, much less so, if at all, for men, which is not to say that men don't suffer oppression and inequality, but not primarily because of their gender. The cost of gender is invariably higher for women. Women are never not gendered. So not including it, women, gender, is problematic and produces skewed, inadequate and inaccurate political thinking and equally skewed and inadequate outcomes. Of course, I, we, they, you, whatever, are never only a woman. Gender is woven into every aspect of our lives and shaped by other social and identity markers like race and ethnicity, social class, geography, sexuality, disability, civil status, and so on and so forth. Gender must be central in the socio-political equation, but never as a standalone factor, because it is always contextual and intersectional. In this case, reflecting on a united Ireland, omitting women and gender repeats and effectively reasserts the historical omission of women from Irish political discourse. Women have not, in fact, been absent from historic struggles, as we now well know, on this small island. But we know that because of the work of feminist historians who have pulled their contributions up out of the archives and revealed the value of those contributions. In contemporary terms, women have certainly been and are increasingly politically active, but it is slow progress. There continues to be a serious underrepresentation of women in public life in Ireland, North and South. You might argue that there are now 3 women leaders of parties in the North and 1 in the South, but we are not fooled in any way by Arlene, Michelle or Mary Lou. 3 swallows plus 1 do not a summer make. It's right for women to lead political parties, but the fact remains that women feature in much lower numbers in formal political public forums than do men. Women do not have parity with men. That is not yet a given, and gender is a problem that has not been solved. Right now, women's equality, as Sinead mentioned, is in fact seriously jeopardized by COVID, re-relegated to the private sphere where their contribution to the work of social reproduction remains invisible and unpaid. The private sphere is actually a dangerous, even lethal place for significant numbers of women for whom risk and danger has been exacerbated by COVID. Further, very likely detriment to women's hard-won freedoms and equality lies in the impacts of Brexit in the North and in the overall economic fallout of COVID. Governments may say they will not go down the path of austerity, but it is always those who have least and least power who pay the heaviest price when the paymaster bangs on the door. Political scientist Claire Pearson points out that women's experience has been silenced and gender equality rarely considered as integral to ending violence and to peace building in the North. The relative success of the Good Friday Agreement did not and does not extend to women's rights and equality. Violence against women is just one very good example of that. So-called hard politics, that is the negotiation of peace, was a heavily male-dominated preserve and remains largely so today. That cannot be tolerated in thinking and building for an alternative united Ireland now. I want to emphasize that my point about the non-inclusion of women extends, it seems to me, just as forcefully, if not even more so, to other marginalized and oppressed groups, generally minorities, who don't fit neatly into the template of person in public life doing real hard politics. Not including women or travellers or people of colour or those with disabilities or older people or LGBTIQs is a denial of agency and worse, however unintentional. But unintentionality will not do as an excuse or a justification, not anymore. Nothing about us without us. A month or so ago, I participated in a Shared Island webinar. Shared Island is, as many of you will know, the Fiona Foyle Softly Softly version of not really dealing with the aim or process of unification. It was a conversation for and about women on this island. There were 20 or so women from North and South in the virtual room. It was a very short session, about less than 90 minutes. An earlier youth session was a full day affair. And the purpose of it wasn't very clear. It felt like box ticking. We've done the women tick the box. What was striking about this pretty random group was that at least half of the women there were people who had or who were or had been heavily involved in community development, and several of them in the women's movement and in other social movement politics. This reflects a very important reality that we ignore at our peril in building an alternative united Ireland. The paucity of women at the top of the political hierarchy is the very precise opposite at the grassroots, where women have major responsibility, unrecognised and unsung social reproduction yet again for ensuring social cohesion. As powerful community organisers and leaders, they are central to this work of creating another, different, equal, just and united Ireland. The UN Women's Security and Peace Wing, part of the Security Council, consistently points to the essential role of women's leadership and activism at community level in the process of ending violence and building peace. And when I think back over the past decade or so, North and South, what emerges very clearly for me is that the driving forces of significant and radical social change have been overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but nonetheless, overwhelmingly social movements and campaigns, significantly led by women and other so-called minorities, including, among others, and I'm just going to do the list without further comment for the moment, abortion. And this all applies North and South one way and another. The hashtag Me Too, and then the Belfast rape trial protests, the struggle for trans rights, issues around direct provision, mainly in the South, but with reverberations in the North. Black Lives Matter, very obviously. The struggle for equal marriage, North and South. Mother and baby homes, the problem is not absent from the North of Ireland. Environmental and social change, housing and homelessness, all different issues, but with many common features. They are significantly all island issues and campaigns and approaches, albeit in somewhat different forms, depending on the context, North and South. They are typically issue specific, but involving and calling for radical systemic change. They're all grassroots led. They are social movement driven politics in terms of their mobilizing and organizing. They are typically coalition and collaborative in their approach, not only within each part of the island, but also very importantly, crossing borders. That was particularly obvious in relation to the abortion and equal marriage campaigns, but also Black Lives Matter, trans rights, in fact, really right across the board. All constitute a challenge to the status quo, all bypass traditional party politics, although they may work with political parties. And it is really interesting in this regard to see that young people, North and South, are now beginning, and particularly I think in the North, beginning to join smaller non-aligned parties. And I say rock on, people before profit in that regard. Many deliver a very sharp rebuke to organized religions. And of course they are young, they are overwhelmingly young, and women play very prominent roles in all of these movements. And most importantly, in the main, they are extremely effective and successful. All of these movements and campaigns have brought about dramatic changes, shifts in attitudes as much as in law, with major impact, even with work ongoing. They are a crucial moment, not an endpoint, in a process of radically reinventing Ireland. Almost all have their roots in decades of political work, women's and LGBT movements, for example, in my own very direct experience. A key point regarding the North specifically is that these campaigns and movements are non-sectarian. They leapfrog over sectarian politics and wrangling. A hugely important impact of these campaigns lies precisely in that they demonstrate that politics in Northern Ireland is not and cannot be restricted to questions of sovereignty or of national or religious allegiance. It's not that people are not interested in those questions, they are, but they say very plainly and clearly other issues matter too, and as much and even more. This creates a sense of a new and a very different political dispensation, no longer a simple oppositional, if it ever was simple, but no longer an oppositional binary, but composed of a complex kaleidoscope of identities, experiences, and ways of doing politics and being political. The BBC Spotlight poll was surprising in some respects. That was the one the other night. I can't go through it here, but apparently unity is the #1 issue for young people. But unity, I think, imagined and framed in a very different way to their parents and their grandparents. They want to get on with it and they want to do it differently. We see they want unity and climate justice, and an end to racism, and the prevention and ending of gender-based violence, and abortion on demand, and LGBTIQ freedoms and rights, and so on. I think now that this is the opportunity to be seized and built on to create a very different Ireland, learning the lessons from the social movement politics of the past decade and harnessing and channeling all of that strength and energy. We want something inclusive, egalitarian, open-minded, innovative, ambitious, and fearless. And finally, and just by the way, if this panel topic were a question, the answer would be yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Ailbhe. Very thorough and comprehensive. So we're going to have Fiona Ferguson now conclude sort of this part of the discussion. We'll then move on to questions and answers. But first of all, I'll let Fiona speak. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And look, just as the other speaker said, I am particularly delighted to be a part of this panel. I do think this is an important issue. Ailbhe's just pointed out the polls that we heard over the last couple of days, and people should go and look those up. We're very often told that, you know, the issue of the border and the national question in the north is something that we'll think of in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. Go and look at those polls and you'll see that that's what people are thinking about already today. But I'm particularly delighted to be involved in a panel of women who've been fighting for justice for other women for a very long time, and particularly Siobhan, because I think her account puts paid to the idea that the church, the state, north or south, have been a force for good in the lives of women, which we hear trotted out anytime, as Ailbhe says, there is a woman elected to the head of a political party or has some achievement in Irish life, north or south. What I want to do is focus on the particulars of the way the northern institutions have failed women, some of that structural and institutional violence that Sinead mentioned, why I think we have to look for an alternative to those institutions and politics, and how we fight for a different kind of Ireland for women. I think that's particularly relevant given the fact that Micheál Martin actually said that Stormont should or could remain in a united Ireland, and that's been echoed by others, north and south. He said, his words were, you could still have a Northern Assembly and the Northern Executive with the fulcrum towards Dublin, but the British government would have to be involved. Now, apart from a staggering lack of imagination on the part of Micheál Martin, that's a personal opinion, I think the proposition of maintaining... Hello?
Go on, Fiona. I think there might have just been a bit of background interference there.
Oh, sorry. I thought someone said that my sound was gone. I'll keep going. Yeah, so apart from a staggering lack of imagination from Micheál Martin, I think the idea of maintaining the current Northern Assembly and the role of the British government utterly undermines the fight for an alternative united Ireland. And it really presents no challenge at all to the way that these institutions have punished women and minoritized our issues, particularly working class women and BAME women. As Sinead rightly said, we're still feeling the effect of partition a century on, which really copper fastened to conservative states intent on the repression of women and our bodily autonomy. The institutions that were set up to manage the Orange State utterly relegated women and equality issues. And even today, under power sharing, we still have vast gender inequality across all aspects of society. Women's employment in the north is characterised by gender segregated labour markets and a high concentration in low paying and precarious sectors like care, like cleaning, like the service industry. And the interruption of women's employment for unpaid care work still continues to significantly undermine women's lifetime earnings. Systemic issues often see women twice as dependent on social security as men, with welfare reform and the wider austerity agenda having a disproportionate impact on women's access to resources, to security, to safety, and seeing our services predominantly stripped away. It's estimated that austerity since 2010 will have cost women a total of 79 billion against 13 billion for men. And by 2020, men had borne around 14% of the total burden for welfare cuts, compared with 86% for women. The North was identified as having the joint highest levels of femicide in Europe in 2017. And in 2018-19, the PSNI recorded 31,682 domestic abuse events, which added up to responding to a domestic abuse incident every 17 minutes. And of course, that doesn't count the domestic abuse incidents where the police are never called and we never hear about them. Now, all of those figures aren't as exhaustive. They're just a snapshot, really. It doesn't delve into the individual stories of women who struggle on both sides of the divide in the north, or the added impact of rising child poverty, a sharp class divide, a mental health crisis, sectarian division, and the punishing impact of abortion restriction that still goes on today, even after decriminalisation. The northern institutions that Micheál Martin was referring to and the British government are responsible for the conditions that women face in the north today, which are felt more sharply, as Ailbhe rightly said, often by the trans community, by migrant women, by disabled women, those on the fringes of society who are minoritised further by the state. They have implemented austerity, first through the Tories, then by Sinn Féin and the DUP in Stormont. They implemented welfare reforms, which have punished the most vulnerable, but overwhelmingly vulnerable women, first through the Tories, then by Sinn Féin and the DUP and the Alliance Party. And just last month, they attempted to roll back on abortion rights once again, a bill from the DUP, which Sinn Féin could not bring themselves to oppose. So taking those institutions, those kind of politics, and melding them onto the South, where the same neoliberalism has been meted out, where the same repression of rights continues, the same issues of childcare and housing face women every day, I think would be the antithesis of an alternative Ireland for those women who will continue to live under the same conditions. And I'm not really interested in that kind of Ireland, to be honest, or a border poll that simply rids us of the border, but not of those kind of politics that hammer my community and other communities across the north. And to be blunt, to be honest, what would convince a working class woman in a unionist community to be inspired to break away from the traditions that she was raised in, to work for United Ireland without the vision for something tangibly different for her life and the life of her children? As James Connolly said of this phenomenon, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So as a socialist, I believe that we need to fight for a radically different vision of Ireland, where everyone has a stake, where people come before profit, and equality and democracy are at the very heart of it, because we already know what we get from what we have today and from a capitalist tax haven Ireland across the border, and how women are treated in that kind of society. But also because without that vision for something radically different, how can we expect to win anybody to it? And I think this is the most important part for me, the fight for United Ireland, and how do we get there? Because that's what will shape the Ireland that we get. And I think that fight has to attempt to win those people beyond us, and also fight for those people beyond us, because talking above the heads of people and solely elevating the voice of nationalism over unionism won't cut it if we want to win the masses of people to the idea that we can win something better. So how do we do that? I want to cast our minds back, and it's been referred to already, of about 3 years ago, many of us were still reeling from the outcome of the Belfast rugby rape trial. Now, it took place in the courts of Belfast, but it was a traumatizing event for the whole of this island. And I think every woman's worst fear played out, of having our personal history, our alcohol levels, our clothing paraded in front of a courtroom and splashed on the front pages simply for having the gumption to challenge a rapist. But in response to that verdict, something really special happened. Thousands of women across this island came out onto the streets in Belfast, in Derry, in Dublin, in Galway, in Cork, and they came out with one voice to say, we believe her. Eamon McCann said at the time, it wasn't a movement for a united Ireland, but it was a movement of a united Ireland, of an Ireland united against misogyny and gender-based violence. It was united practically and logistically, and it was deeply moving, because there were thousands on the streets across this island, shoulder to shoulder, motivated by righteous rage and deep empathy, community and empowerment, and a sense of belonging and of right and wrong, of what we want for the future, flowed through every single one of us, and it didn't come out of nowhere. Of course, it was a spontaneous response to the horrible trial and the verdict, but it also bloomed out of the experiences of the previous year, where repeal had carried the sentiment of women's rights and of solidarity to a historic result. Repeal spurred an Ireland where women were united. Activists flowed to the south on our buses and in cars to campaign. And when the yes vote came through, crucially, confidence and belief surged about what was possible in the north. It ignited a fire underneath us, and women got on buses the very next week to join us in Belfast to say the north is next. It's these movements, I think, that are the heart of a campaign for an alternative, united Ireland. movements today that take up women's demands for reproductive rights, for economic justice, and for an end to gender-based violence. These movements today have to shape the Ireland of the future. And when we do think back to that energy and that atmosphere on every repeal canvas, on every rally for choice march in the north, on every We Believe Her protest, on every campaign you've ever been involved in, probably for LGBTQ plus issues, for racial justice, for the planet, that same feeling is there. And as Ailbhe rightly said, so often when these campaigns kick off in the north, they leapfrog, they transcend sectarian division, and they unite people across the divide, particularly when it's against damaging cuts, which will impact both sides of the community. But that energy and that sense of immediate, unshakable solidarity with the people on either side of you and with the entire crowd, that kind of empowerment of how a more equal world is possible, I think that has to be the demand for politics as usual in a new united Ireland, where people lead change and mass movements of women or of workers aren't quelled by the state and the cops. And just a shout out there in solidarity to the workers in Debenhams, predominantly women, and some of my own comrades and people before profit who were set upon by the cops a couple of nights ago for attempting to protect their strike. Those kind of actions are what should fundamentally shape society, not dinosaur politics of the DUP, not the wealthiest in society, not the capitalists who will drive roughshod through our lives and our livelihoods if it means a handful more profit. And I think that's what we have to say is up for grabs in a socialist united Ireland, where the power shifts radically, where the wealth is redistributed fairly, and where each and every one of us has a proper, active and practical democratic stake in one society, not once every 4 years at the ballot box and then you can't get rid of them when they do exactly the opposite of what you voted for them for before. And I want to say pretty clearly, that's distinctly different than what's on offer today from Fianna Fáil, from Fine Gael, from Sinn Féin, from the SDLP, or anyone else who talks about a united Ireland. And who would benefit more from that kind of socialist, radical united Ireland than women, than the marginalised and the oppressed? And I don't say that to say that we can lead this and it will be easy and it won't be an almighty bloody struggle and the movement to end all movements, but I think that we owe it to ourselves. After so many centuries of inequality and justice, after what women have gone through, like Siobhan, who's here today, like the women who've been on boats, the women who've been relegated and kept out of society and faced closed doors when they attempted to fight back for it. We owe it to those women and to future women in Ireland, because opportunities like this don't come around too often. And I think there's nothing that we as women and other minorities can't do when we decide to put our minds to it. That's what Ailbhe, I think, was talking about when she said change in this society has come from below, from predominantly from the mass movements, whether it's abortion or equal marriage, the movement to end water charges. It's ordinary working people getting together and saying we want to see change. That's where it's come from. That's what has to drive a movement for a different and utterly changed kind of Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Fiona. And I think a very good point to finish this part of the discussion on with the Debenhams workers, because, you know, women have really been leading a lot of the most militant struggles across the world, not just in Ireland in the past year.